Prime Minister Scott Morrison went somewhat reluctantly to the COP26 conference in Glasgow, where he committed Australia to zero net carbon dioxide emissions by 2050, but resisted pressure to abandon coal. His government's path to zero has an emissions reduction target of 26 to 28% by 2030. The opposition says this target is not good enough and is pushing for a 45% reduction. Surprisingly, the Business Council of Australia has recommended a target of 46 to 50% reduction by 2030, which is something of an embarrassment for the government. After all, if business says it can be done, and that we'll all be better off financially, how can the government use cost as an excuse to do less? Who is pulling their strings? The 46 to 50% reduction recommendation is in a paper entitled Achieving a Net Zero Economy, which the BCA published in October 2021. To quote the paper, this goal is both pragmatic and ambitious and is based on research by Deloitte Access Economics, who they engaged to provide a top-down macroeconomic view of the transition. Deloitte modelled a 54% reduction by 2030, with claims of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars added to the economy. Who could ignore advice like that? Nevertheless, all these percentages can be a bit confusing. So I checked to see exactly what they mean. What are we reducing from and to? Let's start with a graph of Australia's total emissions, which peaked in 2007 at 634 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. The actual CO2 is a bit less, but some other gases like methane and nitrous oxides are included to give equivalent atmospheric warming. The reductions of 26 or 28 or 46% are measured not from the peak, but from 2005, when the total was 615 million tonnes. So what does the government's 28% or the BCA's 46% mean in practice? To consider that, we need to look at who emits what. The National Greenhouse Inventory breaks down emissions by sector. In 2005, electricity generation was by far the biggest component, contributing 197 out of 615 million tonnes. Under the Paris Agreement, it was projected we would achieve an overall reduction of 22% by 2030 for a total of 478 million tonnes. This is based on electricity generation falling to 111 million tonnes, a little over half of what it was in 2005. The other sectors don't change much, and in 2020 we were well on the way to the target and even doing better than expected. This table shows total emissions in the middle column and the portion from electricity in the last column. The top row is for 2020 with 172 megatonnes for electricity. The rows below show what must be achieved for each level of reduction. Even for the 22% Paris reduction, getting to 111 million tonnes is a big drop. For 28% reduction, it is down to 66 million tonnes. But for 46% reduction, replacing coal and gas-fired generation with renewables is not enough. The negative figures indicate that other sectors must also make cuts. So how is the BCA proposing to do it? The BCA paper gives what they call a bottom-up sector analysis to show the additional reductions needed to reach 46%. These are in Table 3 of the report, with an additional 147 million tonnes of reductions to get down to 332 million tonnes total emissions. Electricity generation alone cannot do it. Industry also has to take a big hit, and it is assumed electric vehicles will reduce transport's contribution. However, electricity generation is still the biggest player, and a 90 million tonne reduction is proposed. But remember that 22% reduction already limited generation to 111 million tonnes, so a further 90 million tonnes takes this down to 21 million tonnes, which, as we will see shortly, means the total elimination of coal-fired generation, allowing only a small increase in gas, and 50% would knock that out too. The BCA report implies shutting down all coal-fired generation to save 90 million tonnes of emissions, with an additional 30 gigawatts of renewable generation needed to compensate. I wondered how they calculated this figure. In round numbers, for each 1 megawatt hour generated from coal, 1 tonne of CO2 is emitted. The BCA's 90 million tonne reduction therefore corresponds to about 90 terawatt hours of electricity. A terawatt is a million megawatts. Dividing by 365 days a year gives 247 gigawatt hours per day. With solar, you only get about 8 hours a day, and wind has a similar capacity factor. 247 gigawatt hours in 8 hours means 30 gigawatts of power is required, and that sounds suspiciously like the 30 gigawatts that the BCA report says we need.
Surely not. Did Deloitte do sophisticated modelling, or is this whole report based on a back-of-the-envelope calculation like I just did? I'll have to check a bit further.
The Clean Energy Regulator publishes a table with energy and emissions for every generation plant in Australia. I downloaded the data for 2019-2020, which was the latest available, and added up the figures. Emissions from coal generation were 143 million tonnes for 150 terawatt hours of energy. This confirms that the BCA's 90 million tonne reduction requires the elimination of coal. Remember that this was in addition to the Paris 22%, 49 million tonne reduction, giving a total reduction of 139 million tonnes. This leaves only 4 million tonnes, and in fact, you would eliminate coal altogether and allow a small increase in gas to 21 million tonnes, which gives 40 terawatt hours of energy. Total generation was 221 terawatt hours, so renewables will have to supply 181 terawatt hours. The BCA report needs to show how renewables can provide a total of 181 terawatt hours, assuming total demand does not increase from 221 terawatt hours. It suggests an additional 30 gigawatts of renewables will do the job. This seems to ignore the fact that renewables are intermittent. Coal-fired power stations run 24 hours a day, and except for maintenance shutdowns, 365 days per year. So when you replace a coal plant with renewables, you have to factor in that they do not provide continuous power. Working out how much power can be expected from solar, from wind and from hydro, and how much storage will be required is not a simple problem. Obviously, a solar farm only produces power while the sun is shining. Even that changes with the angle of the sun. Finding the optimum combination of wind, solar, hydro and storage requires simulations considering many scenarios in different seasons. And the answer is not 50% wind and 50% solar. It is probably closer to 100% of each. If you don't land somewhere near the optimum, you will end up paying for a lot of capacity that you don't need. Or even worse, you won't always have enough to keep the lights on. Without assuming it is optimal, a report by the Department of Industry, etc., shows a 40 gigawatt increase in installed power capacity between 2020 and 2030. See how the bottom line goes from 79 to 119 gigawatts. This includes a 37 gigawatt increase in renewables and also a 7 gigawatt increase in storage, compensating for only a small decrease of 5 gigawatts in coal and gas capacity. This may seem very conservative, but sometimes the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, and you have to allow for the worst. There is a lesson to be learnt from recent UK experience. Britain has 24 gigawatts of wind turbine capacity. 2020 was a record year for wind generation, with 75 terawatt hours produced, which was 24% of total generation. But for several days in early September 2021, output was less than 1 gigawatt, and it stayed low until November, causing a crisis. Output from gas had to be doubled, but there was not enough gas available. Not only does the BCA's claim that only 30 gigawatts of additional renewables is needed seem wrong, but so does the $50 billion price tag. The Hornsdale wind farm in South Australia has a capacity of 315 megawatts and cost $890 million. Projected from this price, 30 gigawatts would cost $85 billion. It appears the BCA's estimate is based on a high proportion of solar, which is cheaper. But with a high proportion of renewables, you also need a lot of storage, which is quite expensive. The Hornsdale Big Battery was originally 100 megawatts and cost $96 million, but can only supply that power for a little over an hour. I don't have the resources to work it out, and this is just a guess, but rather than $50 billion, the price of a 46% reduction would be more like $200 billion, perhaps even $400 billion. Sorry for quoting so many numbers, but numbers count. You may need to watch the video again to fully absorb them, but in summary, the BCA claims that a 46% CO2 emissions reduction target by 2030 could be achieved with an extra 30 gigawatts of renewable energy for a cost of $50 billion, plus some reductions from industry and transport, which I will not go into here. These figures cannot be right and do not appear to be backed by any modelling. That is not to say the government's 28% target is based on sound modelling, but it is less incredible. I would suggest the BCA has another look at its numbers and perhaps engage some people with expertise in energy. These people are usually called engineers.
And I'll see you in 2030.